So we talked in class a little bit about the genealogy of justice that Glaucon gives. I think that's super interesting. Our focus, though, is going to be on the Ring of Gyges. Here is the passage up there in the right-hand corner. You have a picture of Lord of the Rings fans. That is Dagol, or Dagol, who was the Hobbit-like creature who later became Gollum. He found the ring on his birthday, or his friend actually found it, and he took it for himself. And there he is, beholding the Ring of Power. I mentioned in class that in Lord of the Rings, the One Ring turns the ring bearer invisible, and so just like the Ring of Gyges, it has this invisibility power. Glaucon says, let's imagine, he says, let's imagine that we had the power, the kind of freedom, he says, that came with the power that the ancestor of Gyges of Lydia is said to have possessed. The story goes that he was a shepherd in the service of the ruler of Lydia. There's a violent thunderstorm, and he goes into this chasm that's created, and he finds the ring. He puts it on. He realizes that it makes him invisible. Very quickly, he recognizes that he can escape accountability for wrongdoing. He can steal with impunity. He can do violence to his enemies with impunity. And if he were to do something good for someone else with the ring on, no one would notice. So there's no social reward for doing the right thing. Glaucon notes that in the story, this shepherd quickly turns to immorality and pursues his own self-interest at the expense of others, and in fact the rest of the kingdom. I mean, he decides he's going to go kill the king and take over the kingdom. Glaucon makes an important prediction after that. It's not just something about like this shepherd who was a bad guy. He says no one, it seems, would be so incorruptible that he would stay on the path of justice, or bring himself to keep away from other people's possessions and not to touch them, when he could take whatever he wanted from the marketplace with impunity, go into people's houses and have sex with anyone he wished, kill or release from prison anyone he wished, and do all the other things that would make him like a god among men. And in so behaving, he would do no differently than the unjust person, but both would pursue the same course. So up there you have in the right hand corner the movie depiction of Dagol becoming slowly this corrupt, disgusting creature of Smeagol. He sulks off into the mountains and lives by himself, and sometimes comes out to murder people. And over the years, it consumes him, and he becomes a different sort of being entirely. He becomes evil. Glaucon's claim is that we would all behave immorally if we had the Ring of Gyges. We certainly would not remain committed to morality. So going forward, to simplify, I'm going to kind of smush together behaving immorally with failing to behave morally. You might think that those are two plausibly different concepts. We're going to suppose that one way of being immoral is failing to be moral, and one way of being moral is failing to be immoral. Again, that's, philosophically, I think somewhat suspect, but for our purposes, for now, we're going to collapse those two so that we can clearly state what I think is the core argument that Glaucon is making with this prediction, because it's not just a nice little story or a mere cautionary tale or even a mere prediction. It's a prediction in the course of making a larger argument against Socrates' thesis, and as we'll see, an argument ultimately for psychological egoism. So in order to understand what the philosophical point of this story is, let's think a little bit about what is the function of the Ring of Gyges. Well, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, for one thing, it turns somebody invisible, but the more important function, what is it that invisibility does, is that invisibility removes rewards and punishments for moral and immoral behavior. So I want to note that a ring of invisibility is certainly not the only thing that could conceivably have a function like this. In class, we discussed the possibility that online anonymity is a sort of real-life contemporary ring of Gyges. People's behavior changes when they go online. Trolling is not a phenomenon in real life, but any anonymous message board you've ever been on is filled with just the most vile filth. A lot of it is trolling, but trolling isn't always harmless, and the people who are doing the trolling often know it's not harmless, but for them that's part of the point. They get a kick out of upsetting people, and even sometimes like actually threatening people and putting their well-being at risk. And this happens most prominently in anonymous spaces. The second you've got a profile picture and a real name attached to somebody's posts, you see behavior change. And this is why there are some blogs you'll see online that have a policy of having to post under your real name. It's because we know that people's behavior changes. And this is, you can see here that like when you post under your real name, people can hold you to account for what you say and do. I mean, you can call it maybe, I guess, like cancel culture or something, but sometimes being canceled is legit. Like if you're trying to harm somebody, or if you're trying to whip up, hatred against someone, it is fair game for society to say, you're not going to prison, but like we don't like that, and there's going to be consequences for that behavior. But anonymity allows you to avoid all that. You might think that wealth and power at a certain level grants people a kind of maybe limited ring of Gyges, that the ability to pay people off, the ability to pull strings in a way that gets someone what they want, gives you a kind of influence over those who would otherwise hold you to account, and also makes the people fear you. They're not going to come after you if they think that you have the power to do harm in return. Some other potential ring of Gyges type situations, some of these are more controversial. You might think that certain kinds of legal immunity from criminal prosecution have this function. Someone in class mentioned diplomatic immunity. It would be interesting to know whether or not diplomats actually tend to behave worse in virtue of that kind of immunity. Here in the United States, a domestic policy issue is that police officers enjoy what's called in the law qualified immunity, which effectively shields them from criminal prosecution for things that would be violent crimes were they carried out by a non-police officer. When the police officer is discharging his or her duties, they have an extra layer of defense for using violence against people. Sometimes violence is necessary if you've got somebody who is, waving a gun at another person and you're a police officer. Then it could be that the justifiable thing to do legally and morally is to use violence against them. But of course, we also know that there are plenty of cases that we've been discussing throughout the country recently of what look like unjustified uses of violence on the part of police officers who have a great amount of power and who also have this shield of, I know that if I overstep what would ordinarily be a boundary and shoot first and ask questions later, it's unlikely I'm going to be criminally prosecuted because I have this extra degree of legal protection that an ordinary citizen doesn't have. You might think that that leads people to be more aggressive and to do things that are harmful. Another possible area in the political realm is that the chief executive of the executive branch of our government, the president of the United States, enjoys a very explicitly in the Office of Legal Counsel in the 90s. This has been explicitly enshrined that a president, while in office, can't be indicted. So even if a president committed a crime, the Justice Department has a standing policy of not prosecuting the president while they're in office. And I think, regardless of your politics, there have been presidents throughout history who have abused this ability that they have. I mean, Nixon famously was eventually resigned in part because of some of the crimes that his cronies committed. And I think some people think he certainly knew about it and maybe even encouraged some of those crimes, knowing that there was nothing that could be done to him. Bill Clinton certainly lied under oath about certain things. Perjury is a prosecutable crime that anyone else would be put in prison for. He was not, and he couldn't be. Likewise, I think there was a lot during the Trump administration that the Mueller report, if you read that, had instances of what were pretty clearly obstruction of justice that, had they been committed by another individual, would have resulted in a criminal prosecution. Not the case for the president. And you might think that that incentivizes bad behavior by presidents, that they know they can get away with it. Okay, so let's call in general an ROG type situation, or a Ring of Gyges type situation, generalizing away from just the Ring of Invisibility. Any situation in which, one, there are no positive consequences for moral behavior, and two, there are no negative consequences for immoral behavior, especially social consequences.